By the summer of 2030, I had stopped introducing myself as someone who came from a broken family. Not because the past disappeared. Not because forgiveness magically erased damage, but because I finally understood something important. Broken things can still become beautiful if they're handled with honesty afterward. The foundation had grown far beyond anything Grandpa Arthur originally imagined. We now operated programs in 4 states. Over 200 students had received STEM scholarships. 23 young adults who aged out of foster care had completed college through our housing initiative. Every year during orientation, I told them the same thing Grandpa Arthur once told me in a quiet kitchen when I was 13 and terrified and trying not to cry over homework. Your life is not decided by the people who failed to love you correctly. Some students cried hearing that. Others stared at me like they didn't believe it yet. I understood both reactions. Healing always sounds impossible until it slowly becomes your own life. One afternoon after a mentorship seminar, a teenage girl named Ava stayed behind while the others left. She couldn't have been older than 14. Small frame, oversized hoodie, guarded eyes. The kind of child who apologized before asking any question. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course," she hesitated nervously. "How did you stop being angry?" The question settled heavily between us. Because no adult had ever truly answered that for me when I was young. Most people oversimplify healing. They say things like let it go or move on, as if trauma behaves politely when ignored. I leaned back carefully considering my answer. "I don't think anger is the enemy," I said honestly. She frowned slightly. "It's not?" "No. Anger usually means something important inside you recognizes injustice." She stayed quiet, listening closely. "The problem comes when anger becomes the only thing shaping your identity." Ava stared down at her hands. "My mom says I'm difficult to love." The sentence hit me so hard emotionally, I nearly lost composure. Because some wounds never stop recognizing themselves in others. I spoke gently. "She's wrong." Tears filled her eyes instantly. "You don't even know me. You could fail every class, scream at everyone, make terrible decisions for 5 straight years, and you would still deserve safe love." Her lip trembled. "That's not how it works at my house." "I know." Silence stretched quietly between us. Then I said something I wished someone had told 13-year-old me much sooner. Other people's inability to love properly is not proof that you are unlovable. Ava started crying openly after that. Deep shaking sobs, she'd probably been holding for years. I moved my chair beside hers, sitting quietly while she cried. No rushing, no fixing, just presence. Grandpa Arthur taught me that too. Sometimes healing begins the moment someone finally stays while you fall apart. Later that night, after everyone left, I sat alone in my office, thinking about cycles, how pain repeats through generations unless somebody interrupts it intentionally. My mother inherited insecurity. My father inherited avoidance. Together they created abandonment. But Grandpa Arthur created something stronger. Safety. And because of that, the damage stopped spreading through me. That realization changed how I viewed my story entirely. I wasn't merely someone who survived cruelty. I became someone capable of preventing it from continuing. There's power in that. Real power. Not revenge. Not money. Not public victory. Interruption. Months later, on Thanksgiving morning, I hosted dinner at my home for the first time. The guest list would have shocked younger me. Tiffany and her children came early to help cook. Elena arrived carrying 2 pies and criticizing my music choices immediately. 3 former scholarship students joined us because they had nowhere else to go for the holiday. And surprisingly, my mother came too. The first hour felt awkward. Not hostile. Just emotionally unfamiliar. Like people learning a language they should have spoken years ago. I noticed my mother hovering nervously near the kitchen doorway while everyone else laughed around the dining table. Still unsure if she truly belonged there. Part of me understood that feeling deeply. So while setting plates out quietly, I asked, "Can you help me with the gravy?" The relief on her face nearly broke my heart. Of course. We stood side by side in the kitchen stirring gravy in silence for several moments. Then softly she said, "Thank you for inviting me." I nodded slightly. "Thank you for coming respectfully." She smiled sadly at that. "I'm trying." I know. That was enough. Not perfect reconciliation. Not television-style healing. Just two women finally interacting honestly instead of violently. Progress sometimes looks very ordinary. During dinner, Lily asked everyone to share one thing they were thankful for. The answers moved around the table casually. Health, friendship, second chances, community. When it reached my mother, she froze briefly before answering. I'm thankful, she said slowly, that some people are stronger than the pain they were given. The room went quiet. I looked down at my plate emotionally overwhelmed. Because I knew she was talking about me. And maybe for the first time in my life, hearing that didn't feel dangerous anymore. After dinner, the kids ran upstairs laughing while music played softly through the house. I stood alone near the window watching snow begin falling outside when my mother approached quietly beside me. You built the kind of home people feel safe inside, she whispered. Emotion rose instantly in my chest. I learned from someone good. She nodded, understanding exactly who I meant. Then, after a long silence, she asked carefully, do you ever wish things had happened differently? Such a complicated question. Because of course, I wished I hadn't suffered. Of course, I wished childhood felt safer. But if everything changed, would I still become this version of myself? Would the foundation exist? Would hundreds of students now have support? Would Ava? Would any of these people sitting around my table tonight feel seen? Pain should never be romanticized. But survival sometimes creates extraordinary compassion. Finally, I answered honestly. I wish I'd been protected better. Tears filled her eyes immediately. So do I. I looked at her carefully. Older now. Softer somehow. Still imperfect. Still carrying regret that would probably follow her forever. But trying. And effort matters more than pride ever will. I don't hate you anymore, I admitted quietly. She covered her mouth, instantly crying. I know I don't deserve that. Maybe not. More tears slipped down her face. But carrying hatred was hurting me too. For several seconds, she couldn't speak. Then finally, I loved you wrong. The sentence shattered straight through me. Because that was it. The entire tragedy reduced into 4 devastating words. Not absence of love. Distorted love. Damaged love. Fear-driven love. Love contaminated by unresolved wounds and emotional immaturity. And suddenly, I saw my mother not as a villain from my childhood story, but as a deeply broken woman who never learned how to nurture without controlling, how to protect without projecting, how to love without fear. Understanding that didn't erase accountability, but it did create peace. Real peace. The kind that allows grief and compassion to exist together without destroying each other. That night, after everyone left, I walked slowly through the quiet house, turning off lights. Dirty dishes filled the sink. Wrapping paper from the kids' craft project covered half the living room floor. Someone forgot a scarf near the stairs. Ordinary chaos, ordinary warmth, ordinary love. And standing there alone in the silence afterward, I realized something 13-year-old me could never have imagined while sitting abandoned on that dark porch years ago. I had become the safe place. Not because life was fair. Not because pain disappeared. But because one person once chose to save a frightened child instead of ignoring her. That choice echoed through every life I touched afterward. Which means this story was never really about inheritance. Not money. Not revenge. Not legal victories. It was about what happens when even one human being decides another person is worth protecting. That kind of love changes generations. And maybe that's the real legacy Grandpa Arthur left behind. Teep. Years later, people still asked me the same question whenever they heard pieces of my story. How did you survive all of that without becoming bitter? I used to struggle answering. Because survival is rarely one dramatic moment. It's thousands of tiny decisions nobody sees. Getting out of bed when grief makes your body heavy. Trusting one safe person after years of disappointment. Learning boundaries without turning your heart completely cold. Allowing joy to exist without immediately waiting for disaster afterward. Healing is quieter than people think. And harder. Much harder. On the 10th anniversary of Grandpa Arthur's death, the foundation hosted a memorial event at the original building on Capitol Hill. The same building where his bronze plaque still stood near the entrance, but now the entire street looked different. Coffee shops, bookstores, community art spaces. The neighborhood had transformed over the years, but somehow the building still carried his spirit. Solid, warm, reliable. More than 200 people attended the memorial. Former scholarship students, business partners, families, employees. Some people cried during speeches. Others laughed, sharing stories about Grandpa Arthur's terrible dancing at company Christmas parties. I loved that part most. Because grief should include laughter too. Otherwise, love starts feeling too heavy to carry. Near the end of the evening, Ava approached me again. Except she wasn't 14 anymore. She was 24 now. Confident. Sharp-eyed. Halfway through medical school. I brought someone, she said, smiling nervously. Beside her stood a little girl, maybe 6 years old, holding Ava's hand tightly. This is my sister Sophie. The little girl hid shyly behind Ava's leg. She wanted to meet the lady from the stories. I laughed softly, kneeling down slightly. What stories? Sophie peeked at me carefully. My sister says you save people. Emotion hit me immediately. Because I knew exactly what Ava had once meant by that. And I also knew how dangerous that belief can become. So gently I shook my head. No, sweetheart, I just try to remind people they're worth saving. Ava's eyes filled instantly. Later during the event, she pulled me aside privately. You know that conversation we had years ago? The one after the seminar? She nodded. When you told me other people's inability to love properly wasn't proof I was unlovable. Her voice cracked slightly. That sentence changed my entire life. I swallowed hard emotionally. You changed your own life, Ava. No, she said firmly. You interrupted it. The word nearly stopped my heart. Interrupted. Exactly what Grandpa Arthur once did for me. And suddenly the full weight of legacy hit me harder than any inheritance ever could. Pain travels through generations. But so does healing. So does kindness. So does protection. One safe person can alter the emotional future of people they'll never even meet. That realization humbled me more than success ever did. Toward the end of the evening, my mother approached quietly, carrying 2 cups of coffee. She handed me one carefully. We stood side by side watching guests mingle through the building lobby. Older now. Both of us, time softens certain wounds even when scars remain. You know, she said thoughtfully, Arthur would have loved this. I smiled softly. He'd probably complain the music was too loud first. She laughed unexpectedly. A real laugh. Then after a pause, I used to think love meant control. I glanced toward her. My mother was harsh, critical. Nothing was ever enough. So when I became a parent, she shook her head sadly. I repeated things I promised myself I never would. Trauma repeating itself again. Until someone interrupts it. I spent years wondering why I couldn't connect with you, she admitted quietly. But the truth is, you saw through me. That surprised me. What do you mean? You were emotionally honest, even as a child, and dishonest people feel threatened by honesty. I stared into my coffee processing that. Then softly I asked something I'd never asked before. Did you ever love me? Her eyes filled immediately. Every day, pain twisted unexpectedly through my chest. Then why did it feel like you hated me? Tears slipped down her face quietly. Because I hated myself. That answer stayed with me long after the memorial ended. Not because it excused everything. It didn't. But because wounded people often confuse self-loathing with strength, and children unfortunately absorb that confusion like truth. A few weeks later, while organizing old foundation files, I found one of Grandpa Arthur's earliest journals tucked inside a storage box. Most entries contained business notes, property repairs, investment plans, meeting reminders, ordinary things. But halfway through one notebook, I found an entry dated July 18, 2010. 3 days after he picked me up from that porch. Tonight, Diana finally fell asleep without checking the window every few minutes. Poor child still thinks someone might come take her away again. My throat tightened instantly. Another entry several weeks later. Bought extra school supplies today because Diana apologized 3 times for needing notebooks. Imagine being 13 years old and already believing your existence costs too much. Tears blurred the page. Another. She smiles more when she talks about science, less when discussing home. I think her spirit survived before the rest of her realized it. I sat alone in that office, crying quietly over pages written by a man who simply chose compassion consistently. No grand speeches. No perfect parenting. Just steady love. Safe love. reliable love. And suddenly I understood something else too. Grandpa Arthur never saw himself as rescuing me. He saw himself as protecting what should have been protected already. That difference matters. Children are not burdens waiting to earn care. They are human beings already worthy of it. That truth became the heartbeat of everything I built afterward. The foundation, the homes, the scholarships, the mentorship programs. None of it was really about achievement. It was about interruption, creating spaces where pain stopped multiplying. Years later, when interviewers asked why I dedicated my life to vulnerable young people, I always answered honestly, because someone once did it for me. But privately, the fuller truth was this. I kept building safe places because I knew exactly how terrifying the world feels when you have nowhere emotionally safe to land. And maybe that's why this story resonated with so many people. Not because of the inheritance, not because greedy relatives lost money, but because deep down, almost everyone understands what it feels like to want love to feel safe, to want home to feel safe, to want your existence welcomed instead of tolerated. That desire never leaves us completely. The beautiful part is this. Sometimes we become the very safety we once desperately needed ourselves. And when that happens, entire generations heal differently afterward. Teep. By 2035, I had lived longer away from my childhood home than inside it. That realization hit me unexpectedly, one quiet Sunday morning while reorganizing boxes in the attic. 25 years. An entire lifetime almost. And yet certain memories still carried emotional fingerprints so vivid they could pull me backward instantly. The porch. The garbage bags. The dark window upstairs where Tiffany watched silently. Trauma does not disappear because time passes. It simply stops owning every room inside you. I learned that slowly, carefully, the hard way. That same afternoon, while sorting old files, I found a small envelope tucked between foundation paperwork. No stamp. No address. Just my name, written in careful, familiar handwriting. Sandra. I sat down immediately before opening it. Inside was a single folded letter. Diana, if you are reading this, it means I finally worked up the courage to leave something honest behind without expecting a response. I've spent years trying to understand how I became the kind of mother who could wound her own child so deeply. The uncomfortable truth is this: pain that goes unhealed does not disappear, it leaks into everyone nearby. When you were young, I saw things in you I had lost in myself years earlier. Intelligence, calmness, confidence. Arthur noticed those things too, and instead of feeling proud as your mother, I felt threatened. That shame will follow me forever. There is no excuse for what I did. Not stress. Not money. Not marriage problems. Nothing. You were a child. I was supposed to protect you from pain, not become part of it. The older I get, the more I realize love is not something you feel, it's something you practice. And I practiced fear instead. You deserved softness. You deserved safety. You deserved a mother secure enough to celebrate you instead of competing with you. I can never undo what happened. But watching the life you built afterward taught me something extraordinary. Pain can end with one person brave enough not to pass it forward. That person became you. I love you. Wrongly once. But truly always. Mom, I sat frozen for a long time after finishing. Not crying. Not angry. Just deeply quiet inside. Because some apologies arrive too late to repair damage, but still early enough to tell the truth. And truth matters. Even delayed truth. Especially delayed truth. That evening I drove out alone toward the waterfront. Seattle air smelled like rain and saltwater. Tourists wandered the pier, laughing beneath glowing restaurant lights while ferries crossed slowly through the dark water. Ordinary life continuing. I leaned against the railing watching waves move beneath the city lights, and thought about mothers. How complicated they are. How deeply they shape the architecture of our inner voice. For years, my mother's rejection became the soundtrack beneath my self-worth. Even after success, even after healing, part of me still waited for abandonment everywhere. Love felt temporary, conditional, fragile, until enough safe people consistently proved otherwise. Grandpa Arthur, Elena, Tiffany eventually. The foundation students. The community I built. Healing didn't happen because my mother apologized. Healing happened because other people loved me correctly long enough for my nervous system to finally believe safety was real. That distinction matters deeply. Too many survivors wait forever, hoping the person who hurt them will suddenly transform and fix everything emotionally. Sometimes they never do. And even when they try, healing still belongs to you, not them. Weeks later, Tiffany called unexpectedly while I was leaving a board meeting. "Mom's in the hospital." My chest tightened immediately. "What happened?" "Stroke." The word hit hard despite everything. "How bad?" "They're not sure yet." I arrived in Portland late that night. Hospital hallways always feel emotionally unfinished somehow, like entire lives balancing quietly between doorways. Tiffany met me near the waiting area looking exhausted. "She keeps asking if you came." I nodded slowly. Part of me wanted to stay emotionally distant, safe. But another part understood something adulthood teaches painfully. Life ends whether conversations are finished or not. So I walked into the room quietly. My mother looked smaller than I remembered. Machines beeped softly around her bed. One side of her face drooped slightly from the stroke. When she saw me standing there, tears filled her eyes instantly. "You came." Her speech sounded weak but understandable. "Yes." I pulled a chair beside the bed, sitting carefully. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then finally she whispered, "I was scared you wouldn't." I studied her quietly. This woman once felt enormous emotionally. Overpowering. Terrifying even. Now she simply looked human. Fragile. Aching. Afraid. I almost didn't. She nodded faintly. I would have deserved that. Silence settled softly between us. Then suddenly she started crying. Not dramatically. Just exhausted grief finally surfacing after decades buried beneath pride. I wasted so much time. Emotion tightened painfully in my chest. "You can't change the past," I said gently. "I know." Her hand trembled slightly against the blanket. "But if I could go back," her voice broke completely, "I would have chosen you every time." Tears burned instantly behind my eyes, because somewhere deep inside every abandoned child still aches to hear that sentence, even years later. Even after healing, even after success. I reached forward, slowly covering her trembling hand with mine. And for the first time in my entire life, my mother relaxed beneath my touch instead of fighting for control. No manipulation. No performance. Just surrender. Real vulnerability. "I'm tired of carrying guilt," she whispered. I looked at her carefully before answering honestly, then stopped turning guilt into identity. She frowned, slightly confused. "You did terrible things," I continued softly, "but spending the rest of your life drowning in shame doesn't help anyone." Tears slid quietly down her face. "So what do I do?" I thought about Grandpa Arthur. About interruption. About cycles. About healing. Then answered simply, "You tell the truth, you take responsibility, and you love the people still here as well as you can." She cried harder after that. Not because the answer was cruel, but because deep down she knew it was possible, even now. Especially now. Before leaving the hospital that night, she stopped me softly. "Diana?" I turned back. "You became everything I should have been." For years, a sentence like that would have destroyed me emotionally, because wounded children often become caretakers too early. But now? Now I could hear it differently. Not as pressure. Not as burden. Just regret spoken honestly. I smiled sadly. "No," I answered gently. "I became what Grandpa Arthur showed me. And maybe that was the most important truth of all. Children learn love by watching it practiced. Not preached. Not promised. Practiced. Consistently. Safely. Again and again until trust finally becomes possible." My mother survived the stroke. Recovery was slow. Some days frustrating. But something unexpected happened afterward. She softened. Completely. Not perfect. Not magically healed. But emotionally honest in ways I never thought possible. She started volunteering regularly again. She apologized directly to Tiffany for years of favoritism. She even began attending family therapy sessions with us occasionally. The first session was brutal. The second was awkward. By the fifth, we were laughing sometimes between tears. Healing is strange like that. Messy. Uneven. Human. And maybe that's the final lesson this story was always moving toward. People can absolutely destroy each other emotionally. Families can fracture so deeply it changes the course of entire lives. But pain does not have to become inheritance. Love can be relearned. Truth can arrive late and still matter. And one safe person, just one, can interrupt generations of damage long enough for something healthier to finally grow in its place. There was one final place I avoided for almost 20 years. The house in Southeast Portland. The house with the narrow porch. The cracked concrete steps. The upstairs window where my sister once stood hidden behind curtains while I waited alone in the dark believing my life had ended. After my mother's stroke, Tiffany mentioned casually during one of our therapy sessions that the house was being sold. The mortgage got too expensive after Dad got sick, she explained quietly. Mom can't maintain it anymore. Something strange moved through me hearing that. Not satisfaction. Not sadness exactly. Just the eerie feeling of time finally closing a circle. A week later, I drove there alone. Rain drizzled softly across Portland streets the entire afternoon. When I turned onto the old block, my chest tightened so sharply I nearly kept driving. Everything looked smaller. That surprised me most. Childhood homes shrink once fear no longer lives inside them. I parked across the street staring at the house through the windshield. The same faded beige siding. The same crooked mailbox. The same porch where 13-year-old me once sat wrapped in silence while nobody came outside. For several minutes I couldn't move. Then finally I stepped out into the rain. The air smelled exactly the same. Wet pavement. Old cedar. Cold wind. Memory rushed through my body so intensely it almost felt physical. I walked slowly toward the porch. Every step carried two versions of me simultaneously. The woman I had become, and the terrified child still frozen somewhere inside that summer night. When I reached the front steps, emotion hit so hard I grabbed the railing to steady myself. Because suddenly I could see it all again. The garbage bags. My shaking hands. Watching car headlights pass hoping one would stop. Trying not to cry because crying made my mother angrier. I closed my eyes breathing carefully through the memory. Then quietly, aloud, I spoke to the version of myself who never truly left this porch emotionally. You survived. Rain tapped softly against the roof above me. You thought nobody would come for you. My voice cracked. But someone did. Tears slipped down my face mixing with rainwater. And someday, I whispered, you're going to build a life so full of love that this night won't own you anymore. For several moments I simply stood there crying quietly. Not broken. Not drowning. Just grieving honestly for the child I once was. Then, unexpectedly, the front door opened. An elderly woman stepped outside, looking startled. Oh goodness, she said gently. Are you all right? I wiped my face embarrassed. Yes, sorry. I used to live here years ago. Understanding softened her expression immediately. This house holds a lot of memories then. She had no idea. I nodded quietly. My family is selling it? Yes. We close next month. She hesitated before asking carefully, would you like to see inside one last time? Every instinct screamed no. Too dangerous. Too painful. But healing sometimes requires returning to places fear convinced you never survived. So after a long pause, I answered softly. Okay. The inside smelled different immediately. Fresh paint. Lavender cleaner. New furniture. But beneath all that, traces remained. The narrow hallway. The staircase. The kitchen where birthdays once felt uneven. I walked through each room slowly while the elderly woman respectfully gave me space. When I reached the staircase leading upstairs, my heartbeat quickened painfully. Halfway up, I nearly turned around. Then I remembered Ava. The scholarship students. Every frightened child who believed painful beginnings determined permanent endings. So I kept climbing. At the top of the stairs stood my old bedroom. Smaller than memory. The walls painted pale green now instead of faded blue. A child's bookshelf sat near the window. Different family. Different story. I stepped carefully inside. And suddenly, unexpectedly, peace settled over me. Because the room no longer felt haunted. It just felt ordinary. Safe even. A little girl's laughter drifted faintly from outside, somewhere down the street. Life continuing. New memories replacing old pain. I moved toward the window slowly. The same window Tiffany once watched from. the same angle overlooking the porch below. Standing there now as an adult, I finally understood something devastating. My sister had been a child too, 15 years old. Scared. Powerless. Trauma spreads through households differently but still damages everyone inside them. Even witnesses. Especially witnesses. I touched the window frame gently, then whispered something I never imagined saying, "I forgive all of us for being children in a house full of broken adults." That sentence changed something inside me permanently. Because forgiveness finally stopped feeling like surrender. Instead, it felt like release. Downstairs, the elderly woman waited kindly near the kitchen. "Thank you," I told her sincerely. She smiled warmly. "You know, the couple buying this house has 2 little boys." Emotion tightened softly in my chest. "Really?" "They're very excited. Apparently one wants to become an astronaut." I laughed quietly through lingering tears. "Then he'll need lots of science books." Her smile widened. "I'll tell his parents." Before leaving, I took one last look at the porch through the front doorway. But this time, the image changed. I no longer saw abandonment first. I saw survival. Because that porch was not where my life ended. It was where a different life began. The drive back to Seattle felt strangely peaceful. Not happy exactly. Just complete, as if some old emotional debt had finally been paid. That night at home, I opened Grandpa Arthur's journal again. I reread one particular entry written shortly after he took me in. "Diana keeps apologizing for taking up space. I hope someday she understands love is not something she must earn through perfection." I stared at those words for a very long time. Then finally, at 38 years old, sitting safely inside a home filled with warmth and chosen family and hard-earned peace, I believed him completely. A few months later, during the annual foundation gala, I stood on stage looking out across hundreds of faces, students, families, volunteers, people whose lives had intertwined with mine, because one man chose compassion on an ordinary night long ago. Near the front sat Tiffany and her children. Beside them sat my mother, older now, softer now, applauding proudly beside people she once would have judged out of insecurity. And suddenly, I realized something overwhelming. This story had stopped belonging only to me years ago. It belonged to every person who ever survived rejection and still chose kindness afterward. Every person who broke a destructive cycle instead of repeating it. Every person who became the safe place they once desperately needed themselves. I stepped toward the microphone quietly. "When people hear my story," I began, "they often focus on the inheritance." Soft laughter moved through the audience. But money was never the real inheritance. The room grew still. The real inheritance was love practiced consistently enough to rewrite someone's understanding of their own worth. Emotion thickened my voice slightly. A man once looked at a frightened 13-year-old girl sitting alone on a porch and decided she deserved safety. That decision changed every part of my life afterward. I glanced toward the scholarship students seated together near the stage. "And now all of you get to continue that legacy." Silence filled the ballroom completely. "Not through money, through how you love people, through how you protect vulnerable hearts, through whether pain stops with you or continues through you." Several students were crying openly now. Honestly, so was I. Then I finished with the truest sentence I had ever spoken publicly. "You are not defined by who failed to love you correctly. You are defined by what you choose to become afterward." The applause lasted a long time. But standing there beneath warm lights surrounded by people who genuinely cared for one another, I finally understood the ending Grandpa Arthur would have wanted for this story. Not revenge. Not victory. Not humiliation. Healing. Because at the end of everything, the people who hurt us most are still human beings carrying wounds we may never fully understand. That does not excuse cruelty, but it reminds us of something important. Pain can spread through generations endlessly, unless someone brave enough decides to turn suffering into compassion instead. Grandpa Arthur made that choice for me, and because he did, I spent the rest of my life making it for others too. So if you take anything from this story, let it be this. You are not too damaged to be deeply loved. Your past does not disqualify you from building something beautiful. And sometimes the greatest act of healing is becoming the person you once needed most. Thank you for staying through this story with me. If any part of it touched your heart, I hope you carry one message forward into your own life. Love people gently. Protect vulnerable hearts. And never underestimate how one act of kindness can change the direction of someone's entire future forever. The funeral took place on a cold gray Thursday morning in Portland. Typical Oregon weather. Low clouds. Steady drizzle. The kind of sky that feels heavy before you even step outside. I almost turned the car around twice on the drive there. Not because I was afraid of seeing my family again. That fear had faded years ago. What scared me now was something harder to explain. I was afraid of grieving someone I still hadn't fully forgiven. People like simple stories. Good people. Bad people. Victims. Via. But real families are rarely that clean. Real life is messier. A person can fail you deeply and still love you imperfectly. A parent can wound a child and still regret it forever afterward. That contradiction sat heavily in my chest as I parked outside the small funeral chapel. I stayed in the car for several extra minutes, watching rain slide across the windshield. Then finally, I whispered something to myself. Grandpa Arthur used to say before difficult meetings, just tell the truth and let that be enough. Inside, the chapel smelled faintly like lilies and old wood polish. Soft piano music played somewhere near the front. The room wasn't crowded, maybe 30 people total. Former coworkers from the garage. A few neighbors. Some distant relatives I barely remembered. No dramatic gathering. No grand farewell. Just a quiet service for a quiet man who spent most of his life avoiding conflict until conflict eventually consumed everything around him anyway. Tiffany spotted me first. Her eyes filled immediately when she walked toward me. For one awkward second, neither of us knew whether to hug. Then she stepped forward carefully, and I let her. She cried softly against my shoulder. Not loudly. Not theatrically. Just exhausted grief, finally escaping. "Thank you for coming," she whispered. I rubbed her back gently. "How are the kids?" "At Mom's sister's house." She pulled away, wiping her eyes. "I didn't think this would feel this hard." "It's still your dad," I said softly. That was the strange thing about complicated parents. Even damaged love leaves real grief behind. Tiffany nodded shakily. "He talked about you after your phone call." A painful ache moved through me again. He kept saying he wished he could redo everything. I looked toward the closed casket at the front of the room. Too late for redos now. That was the cruelest part of time. It only moves one direction. Near the second row, I noticed my mother sitting alone. Sandra looked dramatically older than the last time I'd seen her. Not physically only. Emotionally. Like life had slowly hollowed out the sharp edges she once used to control everyone around her. Her shoulders seemed smaller somehow. For a moment I considered keeping my distance completely. Then something inside me shifted quietly. Not obligation. Not reconciliation. Just humanity. So I walked toward her slowly. When she looked up and saw me standing there, shock crossed her face so visibly it almost hurt to witness. "Diana?" Her voice broke immediately. I remained standing beside the pew, uncertain what either of us were supposed to do with this moment. Finally, softly, I said, "I'm sorry for your loss." And suddenly my mother started crying. Not the dramatic crying I remembered from childhood arguments. Not manipulative tears. These felt different. Older. Tired. Human. "I failed him too," she whispered shakily. The honesty stunned me enough that I sat beside her quietly. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Rain tapped softly against chapel windows. Somewhere near the front, pages of a program rustled gently. Finally, Mom spoke again without looking at me. "You know what the worst part is?" I stayed silent. "He loved you until the very end." Tears filled her eyes again. "And instead of being grateful someone loved you that much, I was jealous." That confession landed between us painfully, because suddenly I could see it clearly. My mother hadn't hated me because I was worthless. She hated me because Grandpa Arthur gave me the unconditional love she herself never learned how to give or receive. Broken people sometimes resent the healing they don't understand. "I spent years convincing myself you ruined this family," she whispered. "But the truth is, I was already breaking long before you were born." I looked at her carefully. For the first time in my entire life, Sandra sounded emotionally honest. No performance, no controlling narrative. Just regret. Raw and humiliating. "Did you ever love me?" I asked quietly before I could stop myself. The question hung heavily between us. Mom closed her eyes immediately, like the words physically hurt. Yes. Her answer came instantly. Too instantly to fake. I loved you, she whispered. Every time I looked at you, I saw everything in myself I didn't know how to fix. A tear slipped down her cheek. You were sensitive, smart, hopeful. Harold encouraged those things in you, and it terrified me because nobody ever encouraged them in me. I stared ahead silently, trying to process that generational pain. Passed downward quietly until someone finally interrupts it. Mom twisted trembling fingers together in her lap. My mother used to tell me love had to be earned, she admitted softly. Perfection, obedience, sacrifice. That was the only way people stayed. Suddenly, so many pieces connected painfully inside my head. Her favoritism, her control, her emotional coldness. Not excuses. Explanations. And explanations matter because they stop pain from becoming mythology. You punished me for needing love naturally, I said quietly. Fresh tears filled her eyes. Yes. The honesty nearly shattered me. I didn't know how to give what I never received myself. For several moments we simply sat together grieving different versions of the same broken family. Then softly I said the truest thing I could. You still had a choice. Mom nodded immediately. I know. That mattered too. Accountability and compassion can exist together. One does not erase the other. The service began a few minutes later. I listened quietly while old coworkers described Dad's kindness at the garage. His patience teaching younger mechanics. The way he stayed late helping people who couldn't afford repairs. The way he never talked badly about others, even when life disappointed him. And slowly, painfully, I understood something difficult. My father had not been an evil man. He had been a weak man. And weakness destroys families just as effectively sometimes. At the end of the service, the pastor invited anyone who wished to share memories. To my own surprise, I stood. 30 faces turned toward me. I walked slowly toward the front, feeling my heartbeat everywhere. Then I looked down at the folded paper in my hands and decided not to read it. Instead, I simply spoke honestly. My father and I had a complicated relationship. The room grew very still. But near the end of his life, he called me and apologized for failing me when I was a child. Emotion tightened my throat slightly. That conversation mattered more than he probably realized. I glanced briefly toward Mom and Tiffany. Families are complicated. People hurt each other, sometimes deeply. But I think one of the bravest things a person can do is finally tell the truth after a lifetime of hiding from it. The chapel remained silent, except for soft rain outside. My father was imperfect, I continued quietly. But before he died, he tried to be honest. And honesty matters, even late, especially late. I looked toward the casket one final time. I hope he found peace. Then I returned to my seat, trembling slightly. After the burial, people slowly dispersed into the wet afternoon. Tiffany hugged me tightly before leaving with the kids. Mom lingered nearby uncertainly. Finally, she walked toward me carefully. I don't expect forgiveness, she said softly. I know, but thank you for speaking kindly about him today. I nodded once. Then, unexpectedly, she reached into her purse and pulled out a small worn photograph. I found this after he passed. She handed it to me with shaking fingers. The photo stopped my breath completely. It was me. Age 6 maybe. Sitting on Dad's shoulders at the zoo laughing wildly while he grinned up at me. I had never seen the picture before. He kept it in his wallet for 20 years, Mom whispered. Tears blurred my vision instantly. Even after everything. Even after silence. Even after losing me. He carried that photo anyway. Something inside me cracked open completely then. Not reconciliation. Not restored family. Just grief finally becoming fully human instead of frozen anger. I pressed trembling fingers against the photograph carefully. Thank you, I whispered. Mom nodded weakly. Then, after a long, painful hesitation, she asked, would it be all right if, maybe someday, we had coffee? The old version of me would have panicked at that question. Felt pressured. Cornered. Responsible for her healing. But therapy and time had taught me something important. Boundaries are not cruelty. They are clarity. So I answered honestly, maybe someday. Not yes. Not no. Just truth. And surprisingly, she accepted it quietly. No manipulation. No guilt. Just a small, sad nod. That's more than I deserve. As she walked away toward her car through soft rain, I stood alone beside the cemetery for a long time, holding that photograph. The little girl in the picture looked so joyful, so safe. I realized suddenly that child had always existed, even during the worst years, even on the porch, even through abandonment. Nobody had completely destroyed her. Because love leaves traces. Grandpa Arthur's love rebuilt me loudly. But maybe somewhere beneath all the damage, my father's imperfect love had survived quietly too. Not enough to protect me, but enough that losing me haunted him forever. And maybe that mattered. Not to excuse what happened, but to understand it fully enough that the pain could finally stop traveling forward into future generations. That night back in Seattle, I placed the zoo photograph beside Grandpa Arthur's picture on my bookshelf. Side by side, the man who loved me bravely, and the man who loved me weakly. Both part of my story, both teaching me different lessons about family. Then I sat alone in the peaceful silence of my home and realized something beautiful. Healing had changed the ending completely. Years ago, I wanted victory. Then I wanted justice. But now? What I wanted most was freedom. Freedom from bitterness. Freedom from needing people who failed me to become different before I allowed myself peace. Freedom from carrying wounds like permanent identity. And sitting there surrounded by warmth, safety, chosen family, meaningful work, and a life built carefully from pain instead of destroyed by it, I finally understood something Grandpa Arthur had been trying to teach me all along. Your past may explain you, but it never gets to own you forever.